You are watching Co-op for Two, broadcasting live from Champaign, Illinois, Sunday, May 12th, 2024, around 3 p.m. You're here for our final session of Sherlock Holmes' murder mystery Dossier, A Study in Scarlet, which is a retelling of the first novel starring Sherlock Holmes. Let me check in with the chat. I'm not sure anyone is actually here with me today. We've been dropping off viewers as we go through this game. Perry is here. Okay, so I'm not here completely alone. We're going to finish the case today. And then we're going to talk a little bit about it. If you've joined me for the previous 3 sessions, this is a really experimental book. It's clearly inspired by Dennis Wheatley's 1930s Dossier games, books, which were hugely popular in the 1930s. Of course, this original Sherlock Holmes novel was written in 1878 or so, long predates those, but this is an attempt to turn it into a Dossier game. It's beautifully produced, but I think it's not quite working. It's working to some extent, but there are some issues, and I'd like to talk about those when we finish. So if you have some ideas, if you have some thoughts about the experience, I'd like to hear it. Maybe from a game design perspective, we can talk a little bit about what works and what doesn't, and maybe how you might try to fix it. A little bit of bookkeeping on other matters before we get into today's session. I've tentatively scheduled the 11th playthrough of the Seventh Citadel for tomorrow. That's going to depend on Jonathan's availability, but we've been having a really good time with the Seventh Citadel. And as soon as we finish the current threat, and I think we're on the last scenario, I will record a spoiler-free review of it. It's a very interesting, weird game. I think next Sunday we will resume playing our more typical Dear Holmes murder mystery letters. We'll start up again next Sunday. We should have enough of a set to continue. Stacy in the channel, in the Discord, has sent me another set of 4 letters, so we should have enough to play our Dear Holmes letters for the next 2 months. And I think maybe next Saturday, early on the day, maybe 6 a.m. my time or so, I'll try to play something. We'll try to experiment a little bit with weekend afternoon, weekend morning playing. Maybe we'll hit some people in different time zones. All right. Let's see here. Let's recap where we left off. At the end of the last session, we were actually concerned that we might be missing some pages, but I think we just misread the last lines of the page. So I think we're fine, but I do want to recap where we left off here. So we've got an initial murder, and the guy who's murdered is this Enoch Drebber from the U.S., from Cleveland, and the suspicion is falling on his secretary, Stangerson, who's missing. And we've got the 2 Scotland Yard detectives, Gregson and Lestrade, who are working on the case, and Holmes is sort of portrayed as a little bit of bumbling people. And Gregson, who Holmes likes better, has more respect for, has just presumably solved the case. He's found that where Enoch Drebber was staying in his hotel, he was sweet on this little girl who worked there, and her brother doesn't like his attentions. His brother, who's Lieutenant Charpentier, is interviewed, and he thinks Gregson has concluded that he probably killed our guy, followed him and killed him. All right. So just when you think that's what's happened, just as we had concluded Gregson's account of his interview with Madame Charpentier and the arrest of Lieutenant Charpentier, who should appear but Lestrade, looking tired, untidy, far from his usual jaunty self. He had evidently come with the intention of seeing Holmes privately, for on observing Gregson, he appeared embarrassed and fumbled nervously with his hat, muttering that this was a most extraordinary case. Gregson did not help. He inquired smugly whether Lestrade had yet managed to find the secretary Stangerson. Lestrade's answer was so unexpected that we were all three dumbfounded for a moment. He had found Joseph Stangerson, he said, murdered at Halliday's private hotel about 6 o'clock this morning. So complete shock here that the secretary has now been found dead. There's this funny scene here. Gregson sprang out of his chair and upset the remainder of his whiskey and water. I stared in silence at Holmes, whose lips were compressed and his brows drawn over his eyes. The plot thickens, he muttered. Lestrade grumbled that it was thick enough already. And when Gregson queried the news, he replied petulantly that he had just come from the room and had been the first to discover what had occurred. Okay, so Holmes says, what the hell happened? Watson's so flabbergasted he can't even take notes. And then we've got the police report of finding Stangerson. Okay, so what are we told? He tracks down the Stangerson in his hotel, checking around, and this reminds me of a great show on Netflix that I highly recommend, Ridley. A very beautifully filmed miniseries, and sort of cat and mouse detective, turns into a cat and mouse detective story. Really highly recommend it. All right, so we get told that he goes up to this room and he finds a dead body. There's a little bit of blood coming out of the door, little red ribbon of blood. Then he goes and gets the cops. They go in the room. The door's locked on the inside. They knock it in. The window is open. And there's the body, huddled up, quite dead. Limbs were rigid and cold. He was the guy who reserved the room. He had a deep stab wound on his left side, which must have penetrated the heart. And then there's the same word written on the wall, R-A-C-H-E, which Holmes has told us means revenge, although he was a little suspicious of the way it was spelled or written. They talked to a witness who said they did notice a ladder propped up to the window from the outside, but he didn't take much notice about a guy who came down the ladder quietly and openly. Boy, imagine him to be some carpenter or something. So not suspicious, but tall with a reddish face, dressed in a long brownish coat. So I think matches the description of the person that they think was on scene and may have murdered the first victim. So same murderer, perhaps, of both men. He must have stayed for a while in the room because there was blood-stained water in the sink where he washed his hands and wiped his knife. Nothing in the room which would furnish a clue. However, there's money in his pocket, so it's not a robbery. Then we're given what was found in his pockets. He's the secretary of Drebber, so he's carrying the purse of Drebber with some cash, a novel, gentleman's pipe, an ointment box containing 2 pills. Okay, and we have one of those pills right here. And then we get a very interesting scene where Holmes jumps up. He takes the box with the 2 pills. He says he's certain of all the main facts from the time Drebber parted from Stangerson at the station up to the latest discovery. And then he says, I'm going to prove it. He asks for the 2 pills. He crushes it up. He finds the little dog that Watson has brought into the house and given away. And he crushes up the pills. He puts some, he cuts 1 pill in half, dissolves it in water, feeds it to the dog. The dog drinks the water. We're all sitting there waiting, watching. Nothing happens. He's fine. Then he gives a shout. He rushes to the box. He cuts the other pill in half, dissolves it, adds milk, and the dog kicks over and dies right away. Holmes explained with relief that he ought to have known that one of the 2 pills was deadly poison, the other entirely harmless, which I don't really understand how he's figured out what that means, why that would be. He launches into a lengthy monologue about our failure to seize on the single real clue that was presented to us at the very beginning of the case. A sensational deal made the case more confusing, but it just enlightened him. The most commonplace crime, he said, is often the most mysterious because it presents no new or special features from which deductions may be drawn. I was no clearer. Okay, so they listen. They admit they must both have been wrong. They want to hear Holmes solve this case. And then we were shown a couple pieces of evidence. Here's the body of the guy who was stabbed in the left side. So I guess if you're facing the murderer and the murderer's right-handed, you get stabbed in the left side. There he is, Stangerson, the secretary. And then 2 telegrams. One, we're told, is Lestrade just asking for information about Stangerson and this tall person in a brown suit. But then in the room, we find a letter, a telegram that Stangerson or Enoch Drebber sent that says J.H. is in Europe. So this is a little bit of clue. This is found in the room. We don't know what it means, though. It's not the initials of any of our suspects. But maybe this J.H. is the initial of the killer. All right, so then here's Holmes explaining his theory. Gregson listened impatiently, acknowledged Holmes was a smart fellow, admitted both he and Lestrade were wrong. Since neither Stangerson nor Charpentier could have committed the second murder, then asked Holmes outright to name the murderer if he could. Lestrade concurred, and I added that any delay might give the assassin time to commit some fresh atrocity. Holmes frowned. He says, there's not going to be any more murders. I do know the name of the assassin, Holmes says. He hopes to lay hands on him soon, but it would be a delicate matter, for the man was shrewd, desperate, and supported by someone equally clever. So we read this, and then we turn the page, it says both men, and we got confused because we sort of skipped over this fact. But he is saying now that it's both men because it's the man who's doing the murders and supported by someone equally clever. All right, so now he's talking about, this is where we left off last time, and here we have both men, the murderer and his supporter. Both men were more than a match for the official force and would vanish instantly if they suspected they were being pursued. Meanwhile, Holmes took all responsibility and promised to let the detectives know everything as soon as he could. Gregson flushed up to the roots of his flaxen hair, while Lestrade's beady eyes glistened with curiosity and resentment. Neither had time to speak, however, before there was a tap at the door, and young Wiggins introduced his insignificant and unsavory person to say to Holmes that he had the cab downstairs. Before I could ask about this, Holmes was flourishing a pair of steel handcuffs in front of Lestrade, showing him how the spring worked and saying that the police should introduce his own pattern at Scotland Yard. And he says they fasten in an instant. Lestrade said huffily that the old pattern was just as good if they could find the man to put them on. Holmes smiled and told Wiggins to ask the cabman to step upstairs to help him with his boxes. I was surprised to hear Holmes talk as though they were going on a journey. He pulled out a small portmanteau and began to strap it busily. When the cabman entered the room, what's the portmanteau? He began to strap it busily. The cabman entered the room. Maybe someone can fill me in on what he's talking about here. When the cabman entered the room, without looking up or turning his head, Holmes asked the man to help him with the buckle. The fellow came forward with a somewhat sullen, defiant air and put down his hands to assist. At that instant, there was a sharp click, the jangling of metal, and Holmes sprang to his feet again. "Gentlemen," he cried with flashing eyes, "let me introduce you to Mr. Jefferson Hope, the murderer of Enoch Drebber and of Joseph Stangerson." So I wonder if it's going to turn out that what he was talking about here about initial clues common. I think maybe he's saying that the cab, all of the fact that they never ran into the cab driver and saw the cab pull up, these are all signs that there was no separate cab driver that delivered the murderer to the scene, the initial scene, but that the murderer was in fact the cab driver. I think that makes some sense. Okay, so Holmes has just clicked on the handcuffs to the cab driver. The whole thing occurred in a moment, so quickly that I had no time to realize it. I have a vivid recollection of that instant, of Holmes' triumphant expression and the ring of his voice, of the cabman's dazed, savage face as he glared at the glittering handcuffs which had appeared as if by magic upon his wrists. Then, with an inarticulate roar of fury, the prisoner wrenched himself free of Holmes's grasp and hurled himself through the window. Woodwork and glass gave way before him, but before he got quite through, Gregson, Lestrade, and Holmes sprang upon him like so many staghounds. He was dragged back into the room, then commenced a terrific conflict. So powerful and so fierce was he that the four of us were shaken off again and again. He appeared to have the convulsive strength of a man in an epileptic fit. His face and hands were terribly mangled by his passage through the glass, but loss of blood had no effect in diminishing his resistance. It was not until Lestrade succeeded in getting his hand inside his neckcloth and half strangling him that we made him realize that his struggles were of no avail. And even then we felt no security until we had pinioned his feet as well as his hands. That done, we rose to our feet, breathless and panting. Rob says, portmanteau is a large traveling bag, typically made of stiff leather and opening into 2 equal parts. Okay. Thank you. All right, so here we go. Here is our man who just got arrested, cut up by glass going through the window, all bloody. Scotland Yard, 5th March, 1881, Jefferson Hope. The evening of his capture, having shaved off his beard. I see. The following pages have been typed up from a journal found on Jefferson Hope when we seized him. The journal had evidently been with him throughout most of his travels and was falling apart. It was in a deplorable condition. Many of the notes jotted down at the beginning were almost illegible. But towards the end, there was this coherent narrative which he must have put together when he reached London. The narrative is a straightforward account of events. I cannot help feeling that if these bare bones were filled out with some descriptive color and atmosphere, there would be a story here as fine and as dramatic as anything I have ever read. It wants only the man with the skill and the time to bring the tale alive. Folded in the back of the journal was a photograph and a slip of paper, poor mementos to which to cling. Okay. And here is the journal, I guess, typed up. The Journal of Jefferson Hope. The first part of this story was told to me by John Ferrier, who I met when I met him in Salt Lake City in summer of 1860. The events that preceded our meeting seemed worth recording, for they are the background to the tragic circumstances which have so completely changed my destiny. Well, this is fun that we're getting to hear from the murderer. Ferrier journeyed west in the winter of 1846 to 47 with a band of 21 companions, men, women, and children, to seek new farmlands. They traveled safely, but not without incident, until they reached the barren and inhospitable alkali plain that stretches from the Sierra Nevada to Nebraska, and from the Yellowstone River in the north to the Colorado upon the south. They had left one river and hoped to strike another, but either their map or their compass was wrong. Their water ran out, and one by one his companions died: Bender, Indian Pete, Mrs. McGregor, Johnny Holmes, then little Lucy's mother and her brother Bob. Lucy and Ferrier were the only survivors, and she being only 5, with brown eyes, dainty shoes, a pink dress, and golden curls, he wrapped her in a bundle and carried her over his shoulder. 3 days and nights he tramped on without rest, and then collapsed in the shade of a rock on the northern slope of the Sierra Blanco, from where they watched the buzzards gather and prayed together and fell asleep. Ferrier woke to what he thought was delirium. Scouts from a great caravan of settlers had sighted them and took them down to their leader, a man of about 30, with massive head and resolute expression, called Brigham Young. So this is Brigham Young. This is going to be Mormons. His people, explained Young, were the chosen of the angel Moroni, believers in the sacred writings drawn in Egyptian letters on plates of beaten gold, which were handed unto the holy Joseph Smith at Palmyra. They had come from Nauvoo in the state of Illinois, where they had been driven out of their temple. This is the story of the Mormons. Joseph Smith. Ferrier heard the name in Nauvoo and knew them to be Mormons. He was happy to agree to Young's terms that they become believers in the Mormons' own creed. It was the 4th of May, 1847. After many troubles, through which the people showed great tenacity, they reached their destination, the Promised Land, the broad valley of Utah. There, Young showed that he was an able administrator and a resolute chief. Maps and buildings were drawn up, the great temple rose swiftly, and the land was cultivated with crops of wheat. Ferrier had proved himself so worthy on the journey that he was provided with as large and fertile a piece of land as any of the settlers, with the exception of Young himself and the 4 principal elders, Stangerson, Kemble, Johnston, and Drebber. Interesting. So Stangerson and Drebber were elders in this new Mormon caravan. He worked hard, expanded his dwelling, and increased the product of his farm. In 12 years, there were not half a dozen men in the whole of Salt Lake City who could compare with him in wealth, and no name was better known. There was only one point on which he offended the susceptibilities of his companions, in that he would not set up a female establishment after their manner, though he conformed to their religion in every other respect. Meanwhile, Lucy had adopted Ferrier's name and grew up swiftly, helping him in everything and learning to manage a Mustang with all the ease and grace of a true child of the West. She blossomed into as fair a specimen of American girlhood as could be found in the whole Pacific coast. She was 18 when I met her, on the day she very nearly came to grief beneath the hoofs and horns of a herd of fierce-eyed, long-horned bullocks, amidst whom she was accidentally trapped. I was riding past, and I saw her startled horse rearing and plunging. I could see that Lucy would soon lose her hold and fall to her death, so I forced my way through the drove, seized her horse's bridle, calmed the creature and herself, and led them out to safety. So for those who don't know about the Mormon Church, which is an active, big church, largely focused in Salt Lake City, this is one of the few big modern religions where all the people involved who started this church are still around. Not still around, but where it came about in our modern written history. So all of the details of it are recorded. It's not like myths handed down. The people kept notes and records. Okay, he's continuing his story. I had seen the girl ride down from Ferrier's house and guessed who she was. I asked her to remember the Jefferson Hopes of St. Louis to her father, because if he was the same Ferrier, I knew that my father and he had once been pretty thick. She thanked me prettily for her rescue, invited me to visit their house whenever I liked, laughed at me when I was serious, gave me her hand, and galloped away. I had been among the Nevada mountains prospecting for silver, and I and my companions were returning to Salt Lake City in the hopes of raising capital enough to work some lodes which we had discovered. I had been as keen on the business as any of the others until I met this extraordinary girl, and suddenly I was passionately in love with her. I visited the Ferriers often, told them tales of the outside world, of my pioneer days in California, strange tales of trapping, scouting, exploring for silver, ranching. Although Lucy often remained silent, I knew she was falling as much in love with me as I with her. There came a day that summer when I had to go back into the mountains with my companions. I determined to go for 2 months at the most, and then return to claim Lucy for my wife. I won her father's consent to this, told Lucy of my plan, to which she agreed with joy, and said my farewells. What happened during my absence I heard later from John Ferrier himself before his death. I knew that he would miss his daughter when I took her away, but at the same time I knew also that he would never let her wed a Mormon, for he regarded their kind of marriage with several wives as a disgrace. But it was a dangerous thing to express an unorthodox opinion in the land of the saints in those days. The victims of persecution were themselves persecutors, more terrible than the Inquisition of Seville, invisible, omniscient, omnipotent. No man dared to whisper his doubts. The terror spread beyond Salt Lake City as their supply of women ran out, for they needed a high female population to support their doctrine of polygamy. There were rumors of immigrant camps being attacked, not by Indians, and new women appeared in the harems of the elders. Sinister bands of armed men, masked and cruel, roamed the mountains, seizing whomever they could find. The Danite Band, they were named, or sometimes the Avenging Angels. No one dared trust his neighbor in case he was a member of this secret band. One day, 3 weeks after I had left for the mountains, Brigham Young visited John Ferrier. He pointed out that the Mormons had befriended Ferrier, and yet the stranger had ignored their principle of polygamy. This was real polygamy in the Mormons in the early days. They eventually had to officially give it up. Ferrier said that the women had been few and that the company of his daughter had proved sufficient. Young talked of the reports he had heard that Lucy was to marry a Gentile, which the 13th rule of the Code of Joseph Smith strictly forbade. He declared that it was to be a test of Ferrier's faith that he should marry his daughter to the young son either of Stangerson or Drebber. She must choose which. Ferrier asked for time to reach a decision and was given 1 month. As Young left the house, he turned to Ferrier and thundered, "It were better for you, John Ferrier, that you and she were now lying blanched skeletons upon the Sierra Blanco Then that you should put your weak wills against the orders of the Holy Four. Despite his fears for Lucy's safety, Ferrier swore that she should not be claimed by the Mormons. He would rather leave Utah, he said, than knuckle down to their prophet. Meantime, he sent a message by an acquaintance bound for the Nevada mountains to warn me of the danger and to ask for my speedy return. That same day, he was visited by the two young men, Stangerson with a long pale face and 4 wives already, Drebber, bull-necked with coarse and bloated features, and 7 wives already. In front of Ferrier, they quarreled as to who had prior claim on his daughter. Ferrier drove them out of the house in fury, and they muttered curses as they went. There had never been a case of rank disobedience to the authority of the elders. Ferrier's wealth and position would not protect him from their revenge. He tried to hide his fears from Lucy, but the next morning when he awoke, he discovered a small square of paper pinned on the coverlet of his bed just over his chest, which was printed in bold, straggling letters. 29 days are given for your amendment, and then... ... His heart was chilled, for his servants slept in an outhouse, and the doors and windows had all been secured. The next day at breakfast, it was Lucy herself who noticed the number 28, scrawled with a burned stick in the center of the ceiling. He sat up with his gun all the next night, but on the following morning there was a great 27 painted on the outside of the door. In succeeding days, numbers appeared mysteriously on walls, on floors, sometimes on small placards stuck upon the garden gate or railing. One by one, the numbers dwindled down as Ferrier became more troubled and weary, until the morning on which the number 2 appeared on the wall of his house. He knew there was no escape, for he would quickly be hunted down if he tried to escape with his limited knowledge of the mountains. It was in the evening of that day that I returned, slithering on my belly between the guards that watched the house, and startled poor Ferrier almost out of his life. I knew it was a hornet's nest into which I'd put my head, but those Mormons were not quite smart enough to catch a Washoe hunter. I had come as fast as possible on receiving Ferrier's note, and I explained that we had to get out that very night, and that I had a mule and 2 horses waiting nearby in the Eagle Ravine. We should push for Carson City through the mountains, I said, and take all the money we could with us. Ferrier had to hand $2,000 in gold and 5 in notes. He carried the bag of money. Lucy brought a small bundle containing a few valued possessions, and I had the scant provisions and water. Well, this is a serious little story here. We left the house as silently as possible under cover of dark, and very nearly ran into some sentries whom we heard talking. "Tomorrow at midnight," said one, "when the whip-poor-will calls 3 times. "It is well," said the other. "Shall I tell Brother Drebber?" "Pass it on to him," said the first, "and from him to the others 9 to 7, 7 to 5. Repeated the other. 9 to 7, and then the other one says 7 to 5. They walked on and reached the animals. Lucy rode the mule, Ferrier rode one horse, and I led the other along the precipitous route, with a great crag on one side and a chaos of boulders on the other. We met with one more sentry, but got past him by saying we were travelers for Nevada by permission of the Holy Four, and by answering his challenge of 9 to 7 with the password 7 to 5. Our dangers were not past even when morning broke, for we were still threatened by falling boulders, and I knew that the avenging angels would be upon our trail. All depended on our speed in reaching Carson City, but by the middle of the second day our provisions had run out. I lit a fire, for we were 5,000 feet up and it was cold, and left Lucy and Ferrier while I went in search of game. It was 2 or 3 hours before I shot a bighorn, and then I cut off one haunch and part of the flank, lifted this on my shoulder, and started back. But I had gone farther than I thought and became lost. It was not until dark and 5 hours after I had first left that I found myself near our camp. I called out, but there was no reply. I found the remains of the fire, but Lucy Ferrier and the animals were all gone. When I rekindled the fire, I saw by its light a mass of hoof and footprints and a trail that led backwards towards Salt Lake City. And I saw the signs of a freshly dug grave. There was a stick planted on it, with a sheet of paper stuck in the cleft of it. The inscription confirmed that John Ferrier was dead. I took the paper and have kept it ever since as a memento. The good old man had been murdered and Lucy seized. I resolved that my life should be devoted to retribution. It took me 6 days to toil back on foot to Eagle Canyon, from which I could see flags and signs of festivity in the streets of Salt Lake City. By chance, I encountered a Mormon called Cowper, to whom I had rendered a number of services. The fellow barely recognized my haggard features, and then warned me that there was a warrant out against me from the Holy Four for assisting the Ferriers to escape. He told me also that Lucy Ferrier was married the day before to young Drebber, which explained the flags on the endowment house. Drebber had won her against Stangerson's claims, though both men had apparently been in the party that shot Ferrier. Cowper added that Lucy was already more like a ghost than a woman and was not likely to survive for long. But what would her husband care about that, for he had married her chiefly for her father's money. I stayed close to the city in hiding, and within a month I heard of Lucy's death. The night before the burial, as Drebber's other wives sat up with the corpse, I crept into the city, entered the building secretly, brushed aside the women, and kissed Lucy's cold forehead, and snatched the ring from her finger, swearing that she should not be buried in that. I was gone again before they could raise the alarm. Those events were more than 20 years ago, 20 years of pursuit and the hope of revenge. I hid in the mountains for some time, making sorties to put fear into the hearts of Drebber and Stangerson. A bullet through a window here, a boulder crashing down there. They sent expeditions to rout me out, but I avoided them and continued my harassment. In time, they feared to walk alone at night, but I could not survive indefinitely in this manner. I decided to recoup my strength and my resources in the old Nevada mines, so that in a year's time I could pursue my revenge without privation, but circumstances prevented me leaving the mines for nearly 5 years. My desire for revenge did not abate in that time. I returned to Salt Lake City in disguise, and there learnt that a schism in the church had driven out several of the younger men, including Drebber and Stangerson. Drebber had managed to depart with considerable wealth, but Stangerson had left comparatively poor. No one knew their whereabouts. I traveled endlessly throughout the United States in search of them, but my black hair turned grizzled until one day, by chance, I glimpsed Drebber's face through a window in Cleveland, Ohio. Drebber saw and recognized me also and knew what I was after. He hurried before a justice of the peace, accompanied by Stangerson, who had become his private secretary, and represented to him that they were in danger of their lives from the jealousy and hatred of an old rival. That evening I was taken into custody, and not being able to find sureties, was detained for some weeks. When at last I was liberated, it was only to find that Drebber's house was deserted and that he and his secretary had departed for Europe. Once again I was foiled, and it was some time before I was able to save enough money to continue the pursuit. At last I, too, departed for Europe and tracked my enemies from city to city, working my way in any menial capacity, but never overtaking the fugitives. When I reached St. Petersburg, they had departed for Paris, and when I followed them there, I learned that they had just set off for Copenhagen. At the Danish capital, I was again a few days late, for they had journeyed on to London, where at last I have succeeded in running them to earth. They shall not escape. I'm very curious to hear if anyone has read. We can talk about this at the end. Okay, so this is obviously out of position. This should have been before we read that. It says, the following pages have been typed up from a journal found on Jefferson Hope where we seized him. The journal had evidently been with him throughout most of his travels and was falling apart. It was in a deplorable condition. Many of the notes jotted down at the beginning were almost illegible. We read a version of this before we started reading the typed pages. So where is that? So this, I know we saw something about the beginning of it though. Anyway, you have duplicates of that document. Is it duplicates or is it almost a duplicate? That's what I'm curious about. Is it a duplicate or almost a duplicate? So they fight him. But I thought it wasn't quite a duplicate. And I don't know where I've lost it, but I've lost it. Anyway, this should have come first, talking about the pages to come. And then it says, narrative is a straightforward account of events. I cannot help feeling that if this here he is talking about, this could be made into a book. And then he says, folded in the back of the journal was a photograph and a slip of paper for mementos to which to cling. And then here we have those photographs. Scotland Yard, 5th of March, Jefferson Hope, the evening of his capture, having shaved off his beard, right? Okay, we looked at that. And then here we have John Ferrier, Salt Lake City, 1859, photograph found with the Journal of Jefferson Hope. So this would come before this. Okay, so here are the mementos that were in the journal. Here's John Ferrier. And here was the note that was on his grave. Okay. I wouldn't mind finding that paper. Okay. Anyway, here we are continuing with Watson. After we had recovered from the struggle and looked at Hope's notebook and mementos, he was very affable, full of admiration for the way that Holmes had kept on his trail, said that Holmes should be made chief of police, and asked him to unbind his legs, which he did. Gregson and Lestrade were disgusted. We went by cab to the police station, where a white-faced, unemotional inspector asked if Hope had anything he wished to say. Hope wanted to make a full statement immediately, in case he did not live until his trial. He was not thinking of suicide, he said, and asked me to put my hand against his chest. I could tell at once from the commotion that he had an aortic aneurysm. Hope said it was the result of overexposure and underfeeding among the Salt Lake Mountains, and a doctor recently had said it would burst in a few days. Now that his work was done, he preferred to leave a truthful account and not be remembered as a common cutthroat. I confirmed that he was near to death. He spoke very calmly, and I can vouch for the accuracy of the account, for I have had access to Lestrade's notebook in which the prisoner's words were taken down exactly as he uttered them. There was only one secret he would not betray when Holmes asked him. That was the name of his accomplice who came for the ring. When he had finished telling us everything else, the inspector took him into custody and said that he would be brought before the magistrates on Thursday next, and we should attend. And here is his statement that he gave to Lestrade. It don't much matter to you why I hated these men. It's enough that they were guilty of the death of two human beings, a father and a daughter, and that they had therefore forfeited their own lives. After the lapse of time that has passed since their crime, it was impossible for me to secure a conviction against them in any court. I knew of their guilt, though, and I determined I should be the judge. Jury and executioner all rolled into one. You'd have done the same if you have any manhood in you, if you had been in my place. That girl was to have married me 20 years ago. She was forced into marrying Drebber and broke her heart over it. I took the marriage ring from her dead finger, and I vowed that his last thoughts should be of the crime for which he was punished. I've carried it about with me, and I've followed him and his accomplice over 2 continents until I caught them. They thought to tire me out, but they could not do it. If I die tomorrow, as is likely enough, I die knowing that my work in this world is done, and well done. They have perished, and by my hand. There is nothing left for me to hope for or to desire. They were rich and I was poor, so that it was no easy matter for me to follow them. When I got to London, my pocket was about empty, and I found that I must turn my hand to something for my living. Driving and riding are as natural to me as walking, so I applied at a cab owner's office and soon got employment. I was to bring a certain sum a week to the owner, and whatever was over that I might keep for myself. There was seldom much over, but I managed to scrape along somehow. The hardest job was to learn my way about, for I reckon that all of the mazes that ever were contrived, this city is the most confusing. I had a map beside me, though, and when once I had spotted the principal hotels and stations, I got on pretty well. It was some time before I found out where my 2 gentlemen were living, but I inquired and inquired until at last I dropped across them. They were at a boarding house at Camberwell on that other side of the river. When once I found them out, I knew that I had them at my mercy. I had grown my beard, and there was no chance of their recognizing me. I would dog them until I saw my opportunity. I was determined they should not escape me again. They were very near doing it for all that. Go where they would about London, I was always at their heels. Sometimes I followed them on my cab and sometimes on foot, but the former was the best, for then they could not get away from me. Only in the morning or late at night could I earn anything, so that I began to get behindhand with my employer. I did not mind that, however, as long as I could lay my hand upon the men I wanted. They were very clever, though. They must have thought that there was some chance of being followed, for they would never go out alone and never after nightfall. During 2 weeks I drove behind them every day, and never once saw them separate. Drebber himself was drunk half the time, but Stangerson was not to be caught napping. I watched them late and early, but never saw the ghost of a chance. But I was not discouraged, for something told me that the hour had almost come. My only fear was that this thing in my chest might burst a little too soon and leave my work undone. At last, one evening, I was driving up and down Torquay Terrace, as the street was called, in which they boarded, when I saw a cab drive up to their door. Some luggage was brought out, and Drebber and Stangerson followed it and drove off. I whipped up my horse and kept within sight of them, feeling very ill at ease, for I feared they were going to shift their quarters. At Euston Station they got out, and I left a boy to hold my horse and followed them on to the platform. I heard them ask for the Liverpool train, and the guard answer that one had just gone and there would not be another for some hours. Stangerson seemed to be put out at that, but Drebber was rather pleased than otherwise. I got so close to them in the bustle that I could hear every word that passed between them. Drebber said that he had a little business of his own to do, and that if the other would wait for him, he would soon rejoin him. Then he's asterisk here, a little footnote. He says, if no tickets were found upon either body, I suppose they never purchased any. His companion remonstrated with him and reminded him that they had resolved to stick together. Drebber answered that the matter was a delicate one and he must go alone. I could not catch what Stangerson said to that, but the other burst out swearing and reminded him that he was nothing more than his paid servant. He must not presume to dictate to him. On that, the secretary gave it up as a bad job and simply bargained with him that if he missed the last train, he should rejoin him at Halliday's private hotel, to which Drebber answered that he would be back on the platform before 11, and made his way out of the station. The moment for which I had waited so long had at last come. I had my enemies within my power. Together they could protect each other, but singly they were at my mercy. I did not act, however, with undue precipitation. My plans were already formed. There is no satisfaction in vengeance unless the offender has time to realize who it is that strikes him, and why retribution has come upon him. I had my plans arranged by which I should make the man who had wronged me understand that his old sin had found him out. It chanced that some days before, a gentleman who had been engaged in looking over some houses in the Brixton Road had dropped the key of one of them in my carriage. It was claimed that same evening and returned, but in the interval I had taken a molding of it, and had a duplicate constructed so that I had access to at least one spot in this great city where I could rely upon being free from interruption. How to get Drebber to that house was the problem I had now to solve. He walked down the road and went into one or two liquor shops, staying for nearly half an hour in the last of them. When he came out, he staggered in his walk and was evidently pretty well on. There was a hansom just in front of me, and he hailed it. I followed it so close that the nose of my horse was within a yard of his driver the whole way. We rattled across Waterloo Bridge and through miles of streets until, to my astonishment, we found ourselves back in the terrace in which he had boarded. I could not imagine what his intention was in returning there, but I went on and pulled up my cab 100 yards or so from the house. He entered it, and he says, "Whatever happened to the key?" Madame Chartier said he left the house at 8, talking about coming back for that girl. Okay. Okay, so his hands seemed away. At this point, he entered it and his hands seemed away. At this point, Hope asked for a glass of water, for his mouth was dry with talking. He was handed one and drank it down, saying afterwards he felt better. Well, I waited for a quarter of an hour or more, when suddenly there came a noise like people struggling inside the house. Next moment, the door was flung open and two men appeared, one of whom was Drebber, and the other was a young man whom I had never seen before. This fellow had Drebber by the collar, and when they came to the head of the steps, he gave him a shove and a kick which sent him half across the road. "You hound!" he cried, shaking his stick at him. "I'll teach you to insult an honest girl." He was so hot that I think he would have thrashed Drebber with his cudgel, only that the cur staggered away down the road as fast as his legs would carry him. He ran as far as the corner, and then seeing my cab, hailed me and jumped in. "Drive me to the Halliday's private hotel," said he. When I had him fairly inside my cab, my heart jumped so with joy that I feared lest at this last moment my aneurysm might go wrong. I drove along slowly, weighing in my own mind what it was best to do. I might take him right out into the country, and there in some deserted lane have my last interview with him. I had almost decided upon this when he solved the problem for me. The craze for drink had seized him again, and he ordered me to pull up outside a gin palace. He went in, leaving word I should wait for him. There he remained until closing time, and when he came out he was so far gone I knew the game was in my own hands. Don't imagine that I intended to kill him in cold blood. It would only have been rigid justice if I had done so, but I could not bring myself to do it. I had long determined that he should have a show for his life if he chose to take advantage of it. Among the many billets which I have filled in America during my wandering life, I was once janitor and sweeper out of the laboratory at York College. One day the professor was lecturing on poisons, and he showed his students some alkaloid, as he called it, which he had extracted from some South American arrow poison, which was so powerful that the least grain meant instant death. I spotted the bottle in which his preparation was kept, and when they were all gone, I helped myself to a little of it. I was a fairly good dispenser, so I worked this alkaloid into a small soluble pills, and each pill I put in a box with a similar pill made without the poison. I determined at the time that when I had my chance, my gentlemen should each have a draw out of one of these boxes, while I ate the pill that remained. It would be quite as deadly and a good deal less noisy than firing across a handkerchief. From that day, I had always had my pill boxes about with me, and the time had now come when I was to use them. It was nearer 1 than 12, and a wild bleak night, blowing hard and raining in torrents. Dismal as it was outside, I was glad within, so glad that I could have shouted out from pure exultation. If any of you gentlemen have ever pined for a thing and longed for it during 20 long years, and then suddenly found it within your reach, you would understand my feelings. I lit a cigar and puffed at it to steady my nerves, but my hands were trembling and my temples throbbing with excitement. As I drove, I could see old John Ferrier and sweet Lucy looking at me out of the darkness and smiling at me, just as plain as I see you all in this room. All the way they were ahead of me, one on each side of the horse, until I pulled up at the house in the Brixton Road. There was not a soul to be seen, nor a sound to be heard, except the dripping of the rain. When I looked in at the window, I found Drebber all huddled together in a drunken sleep. I shook him by the arm. "It's time to get out," I said. "All right, cabby," said he. I suppose he thought we had come to the hotel that he had mentioned, for he got out without another word and followed me down the garden. I had to walk beside him to keep him steady, for he was still a little top-heavy. When we came to the door, I opened it and led him into the front room. I give my word that all the way the father and daughter were walking in front of us. "It's infernally dark," said he, stamping about. "We'll soon have a light," I said, striking a match and putting it to a wax candle which I had brought with me. "Now, Enoch Drebber," I continued, turning to him and holding the light to my own face, "who am I?" He gazed at me with bleared, drunken eyes for a moment, and then I saw horror spring up in them and convulse his whole features, which showed me that he knew me. He staggered back with a livid face, and I saw the perspiration break out upon his brow, while with his teeth chattered in his head. At the sight, I leaned back against the door and laughed loud and long. I had always known that vengeance would be sweet, but I had never hoped for the contentment of soul which now possessed me. "You dog," I said, "I have hunted you from Salt Lake City to St. Petersburg, and you have always escaped me. Now at last your wanderings have come to an end, for either you or I shall never see tomorrow's sun rise." He shrunk still farther away as I spoke, and I could see on his face that he thought I was mad. So I was for the time. The pulses in my temples beat like sledgehammers, and I believe I would have had a fit of some sort if the blood had not gushed from my nose and relieved me. That's the blood from his nose. He's got a nosebleed. He's losing it. That's the blood that was found on the scene. "What do you think of Lucy Ferrier now?" I cried, locking the door and shaking the key in his face. "Punishment has been slow in coming, but it has overtaken you at last." I saw his coward lips tremble as I spoke. He would have begged for his life, but he knew well that it was useless. "Would you murder me?" he stammered. "There is no murder," I answered. "Who talks of murdering a mad dog? What mercy had you upon my poor darling when you dragged her from her slaughtered father and bore her away to your accursed and shameless harem?" "It was not I who killed her father," he cried. But it was you who broke her innocent heart," I shrieked. thrusting the box before him. "Let the high God judge between us. Choose and eat. There is death in one and life in the other. I shall take what you leave. Let us see if there is justice upon the earth, or if we are ruled by chance." He cowered away with wild cries and prayers for mercy, but I drew my knife and held it to his throat until he had obeyed me. And I swallowed the other, and we stood facing one another in silence for a minute or more, waiting to see which was to live and which was to die. Shall I ever forget the look which came over his face when the first warning pangs told him that the poison was in his system? I laughed as I saw it, and held Lucy's marriage ring in front of his eyes. It was but for a moment, for the action of the alkaloid is rapid. A spasm of pain contorted his features. He threw his hands out in front of him, staggered, and then, with a hoarse cry, fell heavily upon the floor. I turned him over with my foot and placed my hand upon his heart. There was no movement. He was dead. The blood had been streaming from my nose, but I had taken no notice of it. I don't know what it was that put it into my head to write upon the wall with it. Perhaps it was some mischievous idea of setting the police upon the wrong track, for I felt lightheaded and cheerful. I remembered a German being found in New York with Rach written up above him, and it was argued at the time in the newspapers that the secret societies must have done it. I guess that what puzzled the New Yorkers would puzzle the Londoners, so I dipped my finger in my own blood and printed it on a convenient place on the wall. Then I walked down to my cab and found that there was nobody about, and that the night was still very wild. I had driven some distance when I put my hand into the pocket which usually kept Lucy's ring and found that it was not there. I was thunderstruck at this, for it was the only memento that I had of her. Thinking that I might have dropped it when I stooped over Drebber's body, I drove back, and leaving my cab in a side street, I went boldly up to the house, for I was ready to dare anything rather than lose the ring. When I arrived there, I walked right into the arms of a police officer who was coming out, and only managed to disarm his suspicions by pretending to be hopelessly drunk. And that was how Enoch Drebber came to his end. All I had to do then was to do as much for Stangerson and so pay off John Ferrier's debt. I knew he was staying at Halliday's private hotel, and I hung about all day, but he never came out. I fancy that he suspected something when Drebber failed to put in an appearance. He was cunning, was Stangerson, and always on his guard. If he thought he could keep me off by staying indoors, he was very much mistaken. I soon found which was the window of his bedroom, and early next morning I took advantage of some ladders which were lying in the lane behind the hotel, and so made my way into his room in the gray of the dawn. I woke him up and told him that the hour had come when he was to answer for the life he had taken so long before. I described Drebber's death to him, and I gave him the same choice of the poisoned pills. Instead of grasping at the chance of safety which that offered him, he sprang from his bed and flew at my throat. In self-defense, I stabbed him to the heart. It would have been the same in any case, for Providence would never have allowed his guilty hand to pick out anything but the poison. I have little more to say, and it's as well, for I am about done up. I went on cabbing it for a day or so, intending to keep at it until I could save enough to take me back to America. I was standing in the yard when a ragged youngster asked if there was a cabby there called Jefferson Hope, and said that his cab was wanted by a gentleman at 221B Baker Street. I went round, suspecting no harm, and the next thing I knew, this young man here had the bracelets on my wrists, and as neatly shackled as I ever saw in my life. That's the whole of my story, gentlemen. You may consider me to be a murderer, but I hold that I am just as much an officer of justice as you are. You must have known the danger of his accomplice whom I followed. from the experience of his accomplice. Hope clearly had a death wish in coming to Baker Street. Interesting. Okay, and then we've got a little bit more here. Not too much more, though. Okay, so this is Watson continuing. Slept very little last night. Holmes back late. And much melancholy scraping on his violin into the early hours, restless and up well before my usual time. Morning papers full of the Brixton mystery, but hardly time to finish breakfast before we were invaded by scruffy urchins hired by Holmes to ferret out unknown information. No sooner were they gone than Gregson appeared, elated with the news that he had arrested Lieutenant Charpentier. This seems like it's out of place. And this feels like we should have gotten this before finished growing. When Lestrade arrived with news that he had found Stangerson dead. This is what we've got. What we've found in this game is some like alternate documents from previous versions that looks like they replaced. Like we read this part about how they've caught Stangerson in a different form. And so it's like when they assembled the book, they had these leftover older copies that they've stuck in the wrong place. Maybe because page numbers changed, and so they were just assembling these things. They found Stangerson's body, brought in a cabbie who was seized on by Holmes as the real culprit. Or maybe this is just out of place alternate diary of Watson. But here we are continuing today. So he's just describing what we already saw in a different form, how Holmes captured the cabbie. Okay, next day. Up late this morning after the excitement of the last 2 days, Holmes out and the coffee cold. Miss Hudson is not to be trifled with on Sundays and makes no concessions to a weary lodger. Feeling that I wanted some congenial company, went to the Northumberland baths, gathered quite an interested group about me with my vivid description of events, all rather impressed with my inside knowledge, quite like old times. Monday, 7th of March. Gregson round this morning to confirm that Hope has died in his cell the very night after his capture. I was hardly surprised to hear that his aneurysm had burst. Gregson upset, but he has been cheated out of his star exhibit. Back to routine today, and Mrs. Hudson in better humor. 2 visitors for Holmes that neither stayed long, and he asked Mrs. Hudson to take me a fresh pot of coffee while I was in my bedroom. Later, Holmes very relaxed. Tuesday, 8th of March, have definitely decided to gather together all the circumstances of the case, the paper, and as much of the evidence as I can recover in order to publish an account. I need a connection in the world of publishing. Perhaps Holmes has one. So he's talking about the writing of the study in Scarlet that was published, the actual novel. All right. And now we're going back. So this was a diary, 8th of March. Now we're going backwards. I believe this is from an older copy, is what I think. This was not supposed to be in here. We were supposed to proceed directly to this. Monday, 7th March. Discussed the case with Holmes. We tied up loose ends. Holmes believed that Gregson and Lestrade would be wild about Hope's death as it deprived them of their grand advertisement. I rather pleasantly replied that I did not see they had very much to do with his capture. Holmes shrugged this off and said he wouldn't have missed the best case he'd ever known. Simple as it was, he said, There were several most instructive points about it, back to his old arrogance. He launched into an explanation as to how most people only reason forward, arguing a result from a train of events, and how very few are able to reason backward, arguing the events from a particular result. Of course, I said that I understood, hoping he would illustrate his point, which he did, and I took down his explanation word for word. He says, I hardly expected that you would. And here he says, when you do this, what you do in this world is a matter of no consequence. The question is what you can make people believe you have done. Interesting. Summary by Holmes. Okay. This was a case in which you were given the result and had to find everything else for yourself. To begin at the beginning, I approached the house on foot and with my mind entirely free from all impressions. I began by examining the roadway, and there I saw the marks of a cab, which I ascertained by inquiry must have been there during the night. I walked slowly down the garden path composed of clay soil, peculiarly suitable for taking impressions. I saw the heavy footmarks of the constable, but also the track of the two men. He says, every mark had meaning. The art of tracing footprints is sadly neglected, but with practice has become second nature to me. Okay, he's looking at the footprints about when he first passed through the garden. It was easy to tell they had been there before the others because in places their marks had been obliterated by those upon the top of them. This told me that my nocturnal visitors were two in number, one remarkable for his height and the other fashionably dressed, to judge from the small and elegant impressions left by his boots. On entering the house, this last inference was confirmed. My well-booted man lay before me. The tall one then had done the murder, if murder there was. There was no wound upon the dead man's person, but the agitated expression upon his face assured me that he had foreseen his fate. Having sniffed the dead man's lips, I detected a slightly sour smell, and I argued that the poison had been forced upon him from the hatred and fear expressed on his face. By the method of exclusion, I had arrived at this result, for no other hypothesis would meet the facts. Robbery had not been the object of the murder, for nothing was taken. Was it politics then, or was it a woman? Political assassins are only too glad to do their work and to fly. This murder had, on the contrary, been done most deliberately. It must have been a private wrong which called for such a methodical revenge. The inscription on the wall was too evidently a blind. When the ring was found, it settled the question. Clearly the murderer had used it to remind his victim of some dead or absent woman. He said he's calculated the footprints by the length of the stride. Victims of heart disease or other mutual causes never appear agitated, I see. Not sure that's true. Forcible administration of poison, not new in criminal annals. He mentions another case of forced poisoning. His tracks all over the room showed there had been there all the time. I made a careful examination of the room, which confirmed me in my opinion as to the murderer's height and furnished me with additional details as to the Trichinopoly cigar and the length of his nails. I had already concluded, since there were no signs of a struggle, that the blood which covered the floor had burst from the murderer's nose in his excitement. I saw that the track of blood coincided with the track of his feet. It is seldom that any man, unless he is very full-blooded, breaks out in this way through emotion, so I hazarded the opinion that the criminal was a robust and ruddy-faced man. Events proved I had judged correctly. Having left the house, I did what Gregson had neglected. I telegraphed to the head of police in Cleveland, limiting my inquiry to the circumstances connected with the marriage of Enoch Drebber. The answer was conclusive. It told me that Drebber had already applied for the protection of the law against an old rival in love named Jefferson Hope, that this same Hope was at present in Europe. Okay, so this is the non-fair play part of the mystery. Holmes sent a private telegram, got a reply with the name of the person that was hunting him. That really feels like that's the cheat. Like, this explains everything here, this one telegram that we didn't get. I knew that I hold the clue to the mystery in my hand. and all that remained was to secure the murderer. I'd already determined that the man who entered this house with Drebber was none other than the man who had driven the cab. The marks in the road showed me that the horse had wandered on in a way which would have been impossible had there been anyone in charge of it. Where could the driver be unless he was inside the house? It's absurd to suppose that any sane man would carry out a deliberate crime under the eyes of a third person. And suppose one man wished to dog another through London, what better means could he adopt than to turn cab driver? All these considerations led me to the irresistible conclusion that Jefferson Hope was to be found among the Jarvies of the metropolis. Okay. Almost done here. If he had been one, there was no reason to believe he had ceased to be, nor was there any reason to suppose he was going under an assumed name. Why should he change his name in a country where no one knew his original one? I therefore sent my street Arab detective corps systematically to every cab proprietor in London until they ferreted out the man that I wanted. The murder of Stangerson was entirely unexpected, but could hardly have been prevented. Through it, I came into possession of the pills, the existence of which I had already surmised. You see, the whole thing is a chain of logical sequences without break or flaw. Sudden change would have drawn attention to himself. For once, I gave Holmes unstinted praise and told him that his merits should be publicly recognized and that I would publish an account of the case if he wouldn't do it himself. He said I could do what I liked and handed me that day's Echo, laughing at a paragraph which gave all the credit to Gregson and Lestrade and reminding me of what he had told me when we started. I said it didn't matter because I had all the facts in my journal and the public should know them. In the meantime, I said he should be contented with the consciousness of success, like the Roman miser. I was rather pleased to be able to quote this bit of classical learning to my friend. Everyone scorns me, but I'm quite happy to stay at home and admire my money box. Populus me sibilant, at mihi plaudo, ipsi dami similac numos contemplar in arca. Guess that's the Latin version of that. Okay, and then we've got a message from Holmes to police headquarters. Case of Enoch Drebber. This is the telegram that we're told, copy of the telegram that Holmes sent to America where he got the information. He's saying he thinks there's a woman involved in the case. Do you have any information about a marriage of Drebber or any recent circumstances involving Drebber and a woman and a third party? Urgently require names and any information about Joseph Stangerson, etc. And this is the telegram he got back that broke the whole case. Confirmed no criminal record on Drebber, as telegraphed to Scotland Yard earlier. Inquiry on marriage indicates Drebber applied for the protection of the law against an old rival in love named Jefferson Hope. Hope was taken into temporary custody. And here's the copy of the Echo where all the credit got given to Lestrade and Gregson. And here is that article, I suppose. Public have lost a sensational treat through the sudden death of the man Hope, who was suspected of the murder of Mr. Enoch Drebber and of Mr. Joseph Stangerson. The details of the case will probably be never known now, though we are informed upon good authority that the crime was the result of an old standing and romantic feud in which love and Mormonism bore a part. It seems that both the victims belonged in their younger days to the Latter-day Saints, and Hope, the deceased prisoner, hails also from Salt Lake City. If the case had no other effect, it at least brings out in the most striking manner the efficiency of our detective police force, and will serve as a lesson to all foreigners that they will do wisely to settle their feuds at home and not to carry them on to British soil. It's an open secret that the credit of this smart capture belongs entirely to the well-known Scotland Yard officials, Messrs. Lestrade and Gregson. The man was apprehended, it appears, in the rooms of a certain Mr. Sherlock Holmes, who has himself, as an amateur, shown some talent in the detective line, and who, with such instructors, may hope in time to attain to some degree of their skill. It's expected that a testimonial of some sort will be presented to the two officers as a fitting recognition of their services. And that's the echo. And then we've got a bunch of other little articles about the weather and little articles on the back of the paper unrelated to our case. And there you have it. Study in Scarlet is finished. Took us an hour and 20 minutes to read it. Quite a well-told little wrap-up there. I mean, it was a satisfying end story to what has motivated these murders, better than I expected to read. A long, generous diary of this guy tracking them down and murdering them, and this very sort of romantic thing of putting 2 pills in the thing. The first time when he explained it, I said, really, is he going to spend 20 years hunting these people down to get revenge and then leave it up to chance? But you could hear that in his mind, he had gone a little bit mad, and he was convinced that there was no way that fate would let them escape judgment. Then it was interesting that the sort of key to unlock this whole case was in this telegram that we didn't get to see. It's a very clear, stark example of how this wasn't a fair play mystery. In other words, it wasn't something that we could have solved. Only Holmes could solve it because only Holmes had that telegram giving even the name of the person. The one little clue that Holmes talks about that we should have gotten is the cab driver was involved. And still not really fair, but an interesting little element. Interesting element about the nosebleed and how it relates to this guy and how it explains the blood. The biggest question I have is about the original novel. How much of this confession is part of the original novel? Has anyone read the original and can remember how in detail it went into this guy's confession? Let's see. Marco says, I liked it, but it's essentially a rewrite, very interesting one, of the novel. The addition of the documents and photos is certainly enjoyable. I got the impression there's no hint of added material that really allows one to participate in solving the puzzle. Yes, that's a strange choice that was made here. We got no real additional information, so we really couldn't participate in solving it. Rob says, yeah, this first dossier is not playable like the other two are. So you think the other two, which are the Hound of Baskerville and the Something of Four, are set up more to be solvable like a game. The others have questions. Okay. Rob says the other two do have questions. Rob says, I have read the original. The confession was very similar. Harry says the killer story was included in the novel. Is the confession lifted directly from the novel? Because this was the best narrative part about this book, was the confession was very lively and full. And Marco and Perry seem to be suggesting that confession was actually taken directly from the book. If so, then that's an important fact. If the best narrative part of this version was actually lifted directly from the book and not added. Rob says, if anything, I think the confession has been edited down a bit. Okay, well, that says something. Well, let's talk a little bit about this as an experiment. I was going to taste this pill, but given that I don't know whether this is the poison one or not, I probably shouldn't be handling it. I do not want to die by accident. So it's certainly a very interesting idea that Simon Goodenough, the author of this and the other two Sherlock Holmes dossiers, had to take this novel of Sherlock Holmes and recreate it in the form of these facsimile documents and in form of a dossier with some physical evidence as well. We can see the two business cards, the actual gold ring. That's pretty generous, pretty remarkable that they decided to actually throw that little thing in the in with the evidence. But none of these are really evidence to look at and be useful. They were just mentioned in the course of the story and included in the back, but they held no clues. They held no information. In fact, nothing that we looked at did, aside from perhaps some of the photos of the scene of the crime. So I guess I would say that, and then leaves unresolved the issue of the accomplice. And I guess the novel does as well. Marco was saying it was interesting that they didn't solve it here. So this dossier hasn't really added anything. I would say this wasn't entirely successful as an experiment, and maybe the later ones are more successful. So if you're looking at it from a game design perspective, not a game is not the right word, but if you were the editor of this and someone brought this to you as an idea or as a draft, I think maybe I did write up some thoughts here, and I think here are the thoughts I had. I was thinking it doesn't quite work. And if we think about why it doesn't work, I think there may be a couple reasons. The first one is it's the strange situation where the novel is told by Watson. It's Watson's take on watching Sherlock Holmes. And then we've got the dossier of Watson. So we've got two parallel stories that are both told from the same person's perspective. So we don't get that much extra insight into everything. It's not like this was told from Holmes's standpoint or from Lestrade or Gregson. So there's that. So that's a little bit of a strange choice. The best parts of this were when we got a little bits of insight into Holmes that we might not have gotten in the novel. That was the first sort of flaw. The second flaw that we've talked about here is that it's not a fair play mystery. It's not a mystery that we could solve, and no attempt is made here to give us access to any documents of importance that aren't discussed in the novel. So it's sort of like, well, we're not going to get, it's told from the same point of view, the same evidence, and there's no attempt to rewrite this in a way that we could solve it. And so it didn't ever feel really like we were trying to figure it out, or we could figure it out. We knew that a little bit coming into it, but it was still a little strange, though, that also the pacing of it, and sort of like we got these two murders. That was the sort of pinnacle of where the mystery peaked, when we got both of them murdered. And then on the next page, the guy's arrested. And I guess probably that follows the novel pretty well. But from our standpoint, in terms of being able to make hypotheses, we didn't even really get much of an opportunity to do that. But I think the other part where it sort of failed was that in this retelling with the physical documents and extra context, you could see there were glimpses of what could have been cool. Like we got some humorous glimpses of Watson's life. We saw his medical reports in the letter from the hotel. And I wonder if maybe one approach you could have taken to make this more enjoyable, more satisfying an experience is if you leaned a little more into the humorous stuff that was left out of the novel, that's how you would pitch it. In other words, if you sort of, I think this has been, there was a movie, 7% Solution, about Sherlock Holmes with Alan Arkin, a sort of modern retelling of Holmes. I think maybe that could have been an angle that could have worked here. If you were sort of like, and I'm sure I remember something about a movie being done in this format. If you were basically writing this as like the real story of what happened, and it presented it as if the original telling, for example, you could say this, you could pitch this as, what if it turned out that Watson greatly exaggerated Holmes in the novel? And so this would have been the alternate real expose of how the case was really solved. And maybe Watson gives himself credit for the stuff more than Holmes in the real telling, or maybe it turns out that certain things were solved differently. I think that might have been a fascinating way to have a completely different sort of alternate reality story of how the case went. That would have been an interesting alternative idea. Let's go back to the chat. Rob says, I think it wasn't marketed as being a game, rather a retelling of the novel. The following two dossiers do position themselves more as games. Perry says, I did find the killer's tale compelling as it reflected the character of the Salt Lake Mormon culture in its early days. The Mormon backstory is way longer in the original. It's like half the book. Oh, wow. I didn't realize that. Well, I mean, let's look at the... if we look at the cover of this, and there were a couple covers, but it does present itself as, handle the real physical clues to this murder mystery. Match your powers of detection against the great Sherlock Holmes. You can't really match your wits against him. But let's see what it says. Inspect actual clues, examine photographs, study the tracks. Well, it's a very cool idea. I did want to mention here, I've got my little notes. I did want to mention that if this didn't quite do it for you, you could join us for some of our Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective playthroughs, but I do want to encourage you to watch a set of live streams we did where Rob, a viewer on the channel, actually constructed them on the fly as we played. And a very interesting case that we played over 5 sessions or so, custom written case, much more of a deduction element. I definitely want to recommend that if you're curious about a more game-like. Rob actually reminds me in the channel that I've gotten the name wrong. Rob helped prepare some of the documents, but it was actually Matt C. who wrote the case, and I did a little interview with Matt at the end of that. Anyway, if you're interested in creating one of these mysteries, you might check out those sets of videos. All right, well, I want to thank everyone who joined me for this over the last month. It was an interesting experiment, not entirely successful from my standpoint. Whether we'll go through another one of those dossiers, I don't know. Certainly a lot of reading. Whether it would have been better to just sit here and read the original novel on the stream, I'm not sure. Maybe some lessons, but a little glimpse into history, a trip back 30 years or so. Perry says, I like that you take a chance on things like this. Well, it is fun on this channel to experiment with stuff, and it was an experimental little book and an experimental live stream, perhaps not entirely as successful, but certainly worth doing. We'll be doing more of this kind of thing, I'm sure, in the future. Next week, we'll be back to Dear Holmes, and perhaps tomorrow we'll be playing 7 Citadel. We've got a lot of stuff to do. Rob says, this was more visually exciting than just reading text from a book. Yes, I guess so. Okay, thanks for joining me. I'll see you all next time.